Okay, so welcome to marking and feedback using the standard assignment tool. And what I'm going to be doing here is nuts and bolts look at the process of using the standard VLE assignment tool. So this, just in case you're wondering, is not going to cover any aspect of, unless it's in passing, the anonymous assignment workflow that we have implemented within the VLE for harvesting student work anonymously. So I'll be looking at the other tool that's mainly at the moment being used for procedural or formative assessment. So I'm going to run through how you set that up, how a student engages with it, how you would use the same system for marking and feedback, and then how a student would look at that feedback. So it's going to be quite sort of a technical nuts and bolts thing. I can see some questions coming in there as well. I'll get to addressing those. Okay, so on with the show. So the first thing that it's useful to know, and I'm going to assume here that everybody who's watching this has at least a basic smattering of knowledge of how to engage with the VLE. So for setup purposes and for basic navigation, I'm going to assume a basic level of VLE experience. So with my edit mode on, and in this content area here that hopefully you can see my cursor pointing around on the screen, the first thing I'd say when you're setting up an assessment submission point is that you do surround it with some appropriately indicative information that students can follow in terms of time, deadline, what's expected of in terms of submission. Now, the information I've got here is actually more specific to anonymous assignment because I've got the 30 meg limit in here. There isn't really a 30 meg limit for the standard assignment, but all I'm trying to illustrate here is that you should sort of cover very clearly what the assignment submission point is doing. I'm noticing there that David is asking if there should be sound, and there is. But one of my colleagues is handling that, so that's okay. Okay, so in terms of adding the assignment submission point, assuming your edit mode is on, top corner, and you've got a content area on your left menu for where your submissions are going. I've got this one called formative submissions. We roll over the assessments box and we choose the assignment from the drop down. Very simple. That gives us the typical VLE configuration form for setting up the actual tool. You need to give it a name. You can see here we've got the asterisk option here. Put your name in, put any specific instructions that you want attached to the submission point itself. That's over and above the ones that I've already showed you in that content area. If we scroll down the form a little bit and sort of zoom in there, if you set a due date for the actual deadline for the submission, the grade center will indicate when a student is late, i.e. they've submitted after that due date. And you do need to apply a points possible, otherwise you can't submit the submission point itself. Now, if it's formative assessment or it's procedural, then points might not actually be relevant. And although I'm not going to cover this here, you could set the submission point to be worth 1 or even 0 in actual fact, and we can actually map number values if you want to text. So a score of 1 could mean marked, a score of 0 would be unmarked, for example. I'm not going to cover how you set that up here, so that's something to give us a shout about if that's actually useful to you, but you do need to apply a points value. The other thing that is possibly a bit of a gotcha for anybody who's not used this system before is that there's a very strong possibility if you've got a cohort of a number of people, more than 10 students going upwards to, some cohorts of having 150, it's going to take time to actually mark the work. And you might not want the students to see the marks that they're receiving piecemeal. So you'll want to wait until you've marked all the pieces of work before you release the actual feedback or the marks to the students. Now, so from that point of view, it's actually quite important when you're setting up the submission in this display of grades section here that you trigger this, which is by default is on. Make sure you trigger that it's off. So unflag, uncheck the show to students in my grades. There's a corresponding sort of issue here, and you can do this in one or two ways. I'm not doing it here, but there's a total column attached with the grade center, so a mark going in that's not visible via my grades might show as a total. So I'll go into that a little bit later when we get further along. But the important thing here is to know that you need to suppress the marks until you're ready to release them to the student. So you would do that by checking that off, which is on by default. The other thing that you can do, and we've seen in particular some use of this in Anger this particular term, and I'll show you the rubric that's in use by the department that are using it. You would set up a rubric, which is essentially a matrix score system to allow you to mark the student work without necessarily entering. So you can see here I've got the Add Rubric button below where the points possible is. If we zoom in there, you can sort of create a new rubric. You get this screen, and you can see, begin to see what I'm talking about here. So you give the rubric a name. You can set up whatever you like down here by adding rows, and you can set up as many columns as you like. So I've just done a very basic thing here where you might be marked against the criteria of argument, structure, and referencing, and the broad bands that the work might fall into. And you can see here, I've just kind of quite arbitrarily picked the values. You got fail 2221 first. And well, I'll get on to showing you how you use this to mark in the marking section. So, but you can create a rubric and attach it to the student submission point. So you see here, that's it zoomed in. You can also choose how it displays to the student either before or after marking. So you can actually have the rubric visible at all times showing the scores, which gives an indication of the criteria which you're going to mark to, and you can have it there without the rubric score, so you can have canned responses in those cells right from the outset, which I'll show you an example of a short while, and you could only have it displaying after you've finished grading. Once you've submitted your submission point, it will appear in the content area, ready for a student to submit to. So if we go on to how that would look to a student, you can see here I've switched to a student view. I've lost the control panels, I've lost the edit mode, same area though, same actual VLE site. From a student perspective, you go to the submission point, you read through your instructions, if you've put some there, whatever instructions are here. Click on the title of the submission point. The student will then see this. They get to write their submission, browse my computer, browse content collection, where absolutely you will be typically expecting them to browse my computer for a file to submit. So they click browse my computer. They browse for their submission, which in this case got a docx. They attach it to the submission point. They'll see the actual name appear there, and then they just click submit. If they want to view a rubric, if there is one attached, if I just go back a sec, you can see here we've got this view rubric option. If you've allowed it to be visible prior to the grading, then they can click that to actually see what those scores are. So you can see there's that very basic rubric I set up to show what they might actually be doing. So if they exit that and they submit their work, assuming it is of a file type that can be rendered using this viewer, so doc, docx, RTF, PDF, they will all render in this particular way. The student will actually see their work rendered here. Which is great for them. They can see that the submission is accurate, that it reflects what they actually did submit. They can also download the file that they submitted here. So this is the original file that they submitted, and this is a render of it. Now, from the point of view of students seeing this, sometimes if they're wondering what's going on and they don't immediately see this, it can sometimes take a few seconds. It'll put some message up with a little file symbol saying this will take 6 seconds to render. So if a student thinks it hasn't rendered, if they go back out and come back in, they should then see the rendered document. So that's what a student would see. Which brings us on sort of nicely. We've set the submission point up, the students have reached the deadline, they've all submitted their work. We'll get into how you would actually then go about seeing the marking and feedback in the background. So how you would go about marking the student work itself. So first thing we want to hit, so I'm back in the instructor view here, you can see I've got my control panel back. There's a couple of ways you can get at the marking. So you can see a grade center here. I've made submission points and had students actually submit, but the important one is here. This is the one that I set up for the purposes of this demo, so name of submission point, and you can see here, here's my test student has got an exclamation mark. So we've got one submission, all these other students haven't submitted, but this student has, and there's an exclamation mark indicating it needs grading, or it hasn't been looked at yet. So you see here in the grade center, these ones have been marked. To get at the full grade center, you go Control Panel, Grade Center, Full Grade Center. That gives you this view, but there is another way of doing it, needs marking, which I'll show you shortly. But if you're using the grade center to target an individual to mark specifically, if you roll over the cell for that particular person, so you can see I've zoomed in on this section here, I click the little grey circle, I get view grade details, exam grade, and attempt. So what we want to be clicking on is this attempt option from there. That gives us pretty much the same view the students saw, except we've got a bunch of options for actually marking the students' work, including these commenting options here, which I'll get onto shortly. So this column on the side is your main way of providing feedback, particularly overarching feedback. Also gives you access to the rubric. So if I zoom in on that, and before I zoom in on that, let me just cover sort of the needs marking. If you click on the needs marking there, what you get is a list view showing all of the work that actually needs marking. So I'm going to go through the grade center view so you can see that better, but this is the typical needs marking view. So back on the grade center view, I've zoomed in on here, and this little arrow here, you can see here, will expand or contract this section of the interface, and with it expanded, you can see, I can see the rubric is visible there, which I can pop out using this icon, or click here to get a list view. But more importantly, just for the purposes of what I'm showing more immediately, is you can put a mark into this attempt box here, and you can put your overarching feedback into here. And if you're doing, and I know some staff are doing this, as a chap in education is doing this specifically, you can actually attach files into here. So what the chap in education is doing is attaching video feedback or audio feedback into this box, which will expose to the student. For the purposes of this, there's a mark and written feedback put into the actual box. And if that's all you were doing, then you could just click submit, and it would take you on to the next unmarked piece of work if there was an unmarked piece of work. However, if you do click the sort of the pop-out for the rubric, what you get is the rubric detail, except this time you see there's a radio button against all of these cells. So this is the rubric I created in the setup. There's also an overarching feedback field here. This is a separate field to this one. So both these, the feedback in these two fields, will expose to the students if you put text into these two fields. So to actually mark this using the rubric, I just click on the boxes, and you can see what happens is it just checks them, works out what the percentage of the mark is based on how you've set the criteria in the both for split in terms of weight against the criteria on this side and the marks that you put in there. You can see here, checking here gives us 36, 20, 8% for that one as a 2-1 and 14% for referencing. I weighted referencing less than structure and argument in my rubric. And you can see it automatically adds those values up to 78. So if you want to sort of quite quickly position a student on a criteria matrix like this, you set up the rubric beforehand. There's a little bit of an overhead in terms of the setup time, but it does allow you to actually quite quickly mark a student piece of work. When you check these, you can have canned responses in. I'll show you that in a second. But you can also, every time you check one of these, a feedback field opens up as well. So if you want to give feedback to the student specific on that criteria against the grade that they've got, you can type feedback into here as well. So it's quite a nice, quick and easy way of providing formative feedback on work using a predefined matrix of options. And just so you can see an actual real one, this is actually being used by the new IPC department, who have applied this across all of the English-related programs. Now, they've got different rubrics for different assessments, but you can see here that this is got quite a comprehensive rubric against these criteria here, which are understanding, structure, critical analysis and referencing, and there is canned feedback already in those cells. So they've got this matrix of feedback that students get as a document. Well, actually they can see it directly in here. You see this one's been checked, and you can still put overarching feedback on top of the canned feedback that was put into the rubric when it was set up. So it can be quite a good way of rapidly positioning a student against criteria that you set up beforehand. So, and you can see here when you submit that, it actually puts the rubric mark in there if you set it to be the mark that's taken. And you can override this at any point, but that was the 78 that marking my rubric came to. So the other thing you can do with this tool, which you may find useful, as well as giving the overarching feedback and using the rubric to position students against predefined criteria, you can actually mark up this document directly. So you can see here in my view, I've got this commenting tool which gives us this bar of options of which I can select from to actually mark up the work itself. So if I zoom in on that, we've got comment, draw, highlight, text and strikeout. And you've got 3 types of commenting tool, which is actually quite useful. The area comment and point comment, for example, could be used on graphic information or image information. You can point to parts of an image, you can point to parts of graphics. If the information here isn't real text, so you can't actually highlight it to do a normal text comment, you can use these to point to information in the student's document. What they look like is this. So for a point comment, you click in the main body of the work, it creates this little red marker and joins a comment to it with a dotted line. I simply then type in my comments and it points to where I want it to be. Area comment, select that, I drag out a box over the area of the work that I want to make the comment on. Again, it attaches a text-based comment. It works pretty much like Word commenting, so it's nice and easy to use. And finally, the more normal text commenting that does work like words commenting allows you to select the text by your normal methods of dragging across. Once you let go of the drag, this text box appears and you can type into it. So a nice, easy way of marking up the student work. The other tools do work very well. This is what they look like. Whether you'd actually want to use them or not depends on how you're actually going to be providing feedback to the student. But the draw tool is I simply draw with a mouse. What I've done is then make a point comment to my drawing, which allows you to sort of mark up why you drew on the document in the first place. You could also combine drawing with the text tool, which allows you to dump a text box on the student's work, and I would typically choose a different color for the text and maybe make it bigger than what the student's writing is, just to make it clear that it's text that you've dropped on there. Highlight is pretty much like Word highlight. You like running a marker pen over the particular text, so you just highlight the text, it puts whatever color you've chosen over on the right. And finally, strikeout. Again, select strikeout, highlight the text. When you let go, it runs the red line through the actual text that you highlighted. So you can use all of these tools to comment and mark up the student work, and this will expose to the student when they come into their view of what you've actually done in the Grade Center. So when you've done everything you need on the student work, you click Submit, and that will take you on to the next piece of work that needs marking, assuming there is something else that needs marking. In actual fact, if you're just flicking through the student work, you can use this navigation bar up here to go forwards and backwards through student work that needs marking. So if you want to look at what you did previously, maybe a student's work that you've marked already, you can use that to do it, as well as going back to the Grade Center to select work specifically. And you can see here, once I've submitted, I've gone back to the Grade Center. I've got my 78, which I set with the rubric in there. So that piece of work is now marked. The exclamation mark is gone. So that's kind of the basic workflow for the marking from your perspective. So set up the submission point. Student makes the submission. You come into the full Grade Center. You can mark people specifically by name by going across to their cell, or you can go to needs marking and it will give you a list of all the currently unmarked work. Once you're into the marking interface, you've got a number of options for providing overview feedback for the mark itself. You can use a rubric and you can mark up the document. So I think all that actually remains to show you is how this will look to a student. So what does a student see when you've actually finished your marking? Now, for the purposes of this, I've only marked one student's work, just so we can show you what's happened. So before a student can see their actual work, if you remember right in the early stage, I said we needed to suppress the marks from student view. You need to switch that back on. There's two ways you can do this. You can see here, I'm doing this from the top of the column. I click the little grey circle and you've got hide from students on off. When you see this little red slash on the top of the column, that means it's hidden from students. If I click that, it will toggle it back to on. And that is actually the same as going into the original form that you used to create the assessment and rechecking that back on. And for the students to actually see the markup that you've put into the Grade Center, you're going to have to make this visible. So what we typically see here is that staff will mark all the student work, make sure it's all okay, and then release the feedback to the students. So I check this on, or I switch it on here, and the students are good to go to see their marks. So from a student perspective, how they would actually see their marks is either via the My Grades tool, either going through the original submission point, by a route we generally don't tell them about, is to go to the notification system, which does expose marks as well, but I wouldn't necessarily tell students about that. So go with My Grades, or putting in the My Grades as a tool link on your left menu, or direct the students to go through the original submission point. I'm logged in as a student now, the student whose work has just been marked, and I've clicked on My Grades as the student, and what you can see is previous work that's been marked, and you can suppress these total columns if you want, which is actually a good idea if there's only one assessment in the actual module, so marks aren't revealed too soon. But what we're interested in is this one here. This is the submission point I set up and I've just marked, and you can see the student immediately sees what their overall mark is, which is 78. If they click on the little speech bubble there, what they get is the overarching feedback, and what this field does is concatenate feedback that you put in the right column along with any overarching feedback you put in the rubric. So you can see here I entered some basic feedback on the column on the right, and I entered some basic feedback into the rubric. It concatenates them both together to give you this speech bubble view of overarching feedback. if the student clicks on their view rubric here, they get a view like this, so they can see where you checked it, any canned feedback that was there, and any specific feedback that you've entered. They can see their mark here as well, and they can see the overarching feedback attached to the rubric, not the overarching feedback attached into the viewer. To see the view with all of their markup, they click on the name of the submission point, and this is the same view they would get if they followed through the original submission point. If they click on the name of the submission point here, they get this view, which is not dissimilar to the view that you had when marking. And they can collapse and some of these columns here to zoom it in. They can zoom it in using these columns. They can download their work with the feedback. If they click this, they will get an option of downloading their original work or downloading the work with the annotations, which comes down as a PDF. And you can see here, we've got the mark, we've got the overarching feedback on the right column, we've got this, and if the student wants to, they can also launch the rubric itself from this button here. So that's how that same information, the same markup and feedback that you've provided exposes to the actual student. And that's actually the process from end to end of setting up a submission point through to the student viewing any marking and feedback that you've actually provided on the work. Which brings us on to questions. Now I'll have a look at the questions that are already there, but if you have questions on anything that I covered in that sort of rapid run through of the overall setup, please put them on the chat, and I'll try and answer any questions, and I'll just have a look back over the questions that were asked earlier just to check if there's anything that I can legitimately answer there. So take a few minutes to add some questions if you have them, and I shall answer ones that are already on there. So we've got a question there from Joyce. I'd like to know about how to mark student scripts in accordance with the university rules, as well as provide constructive feedback. I wish to be able to mark in such a way that if someone else picks up my scripts to mark, we should have almost same scores as well as almost same comments. This is not something that is really handled by the system itself. So what we tend to find, particularly when I've sat in on sessions with postgraduates who teach and convening staff, is they all get around a table and discuss how they're going to consistently provide feedback and mark. So I've done this with the English department and a couple of other departments, for example. If they're using the markup tool that I've just demonstrated, they all agree as markers, particularly if it's a large cohort and there's a large number of markers, they all agree on what particular tools they're going to use within the markup tool. So it might be they just do text comments or point comments or area comments. They don't scribble, they don't put text on, they don't highlight or strike through, but they all agree to use specific tools within that actual system. In terms of the volume of feedback that's given using those tools, again, that's often decided or stipulated by the convener. So this is a human process. This is markers and convening staff talking to each other and agreeing what the feedback's going to be, how much of it there's going to be, and what things are going to be specifically picked up on in the student work. And again, if you use rubrics and canned responses in rubrics, that can help with consistency as well, I think. But it is something that you need to discuss with, particularly with convening staff, if you're not actually the convening staff but are marking on an actual module. So look, I hope that sort of answers your question there, Joyce. Yes, cool. Also on your point about whether there are university rules on that, I'm not convinced well, I don't know for sure whether there are specific university rules, but departments do have ways that they go about it, and they should hopefully be able to provide you with an outline or guidance on what you should be doing for your students. I've got David Chippett has asked a question. My students will submit posters to be marked. Some are producing landscape layout. How will this look on the system? That's a really good question. I've never actually tried submitting a landscape document to that. I have no reason to suspect that it won't display okay, although obviously it might create problems from screen real estate point of view. Richard will probably be smiling now because there's some use of the term screen real estate. But yes, I think if you maximize the view of the assessment view, you should in theory be able to have no problem with landscape layouts. But I'll tell you what, David, I'll check that and get back to you specifically on whether that's a problem or not. I don't anticipate it being a problem, but I will check that and get back to you. That sounds okay. Are there any other sort of burning questions there? And you can always contact me by email if something occurs to you sort of later on. But yeah, what I'll do now is, assuming there are no more questions, I'll stop the recording. I'll stay online for 5 or so more minutes in case you do have anything to say. But other than that, thanks for listening. And I guess the one thing that it would be useful for us to know is if you have any suggestions for future sessions like this, perhaps the parts of assessment or feedback that we haven't covered here. If there's something you specifically want covered in a future webinar, do let us know. Contact us via email or via the usual route that you would get the e-learning team, and let us know what you would like covered.